Winter, the season of snow, frost, and long, dark nights. But beneath the pristine white lies a world of shadows and terror. Tonight, I welcome you to a trilogy of winter nightmares, tales of isolation, desperation, and the cold grip of fear. From a cursed ski resort to a frozen lake hiding unspeakable horrors, and a snow-covered wilderness that conceals ancient evil, these stories will chill you to the bone. Prepare yourself, my friends, for the frost tonight is only the beginning. In the unforgiving grip of winter, 5 friends, Henry, Thomas, Rachel, Clara, and James, ventured to a secluded ski resort in the northern Rockies of Montana for a weekend escape. Their truck had navigated the winding, snowy roads for hours, each mile stretching further into a seemingly endless forest. When they finally arrived, an eerie silence hung over the lodge, untouched by guests, save for the dull glow of a few lights against the blanketed night. A crude sign on the door read closed due to weather, yet they'd come too far to turn back. As they pondered their options, the lodge door creaked open, and a man emerged, swathed in layers that obscured his face. He introduced himself as Ben Talbot, the resort's owner, and after a pause begrudgingly agreed to let them stay the night. His face was shadowed, his eyes bearing the weight of some hidden knowledge. It's best you stay inside. The storm, it draws things out. He spoke the words almost to himself before vanishing into the darkness within. The friends shrugged off his cryptic warning and settled in, bundling up for a night ski run. With childlike excitement, they mounted the ski lift. The wind howled as it lifted them higher, swaying them above the darkened slopes. As they ascended, James's gaze drifted over the snow-laden trees. He froze. Amid the shadows, he saw them, 2 eyes, blood-red, gleaming from the depths of the forest. They blinked and then vanished into the darkness. James swallowed hard but said nothing, convincing himself it was a trick of the light. At the top, the group launched down the slope, weaving and laughing, the thrill consuming them. Henry, the fastest among them, took the lead. Suddenly, the laughter stopped. A low growl rippled through the air, barely audible beneath the wind. Then a rustle, a blur of fur and claws, and Henry's scream tore through the silence. Rachel, close behind, stopped and turned. She saw it, a monstrous shape, towering over Henry's fallen form, pinning him against the snow. The beast's long claws dug into his shoulders as its snout curled back, revealing rows of serrated teeth. With a savage growl, it plunged down, its jaws sinking into his throat. Blood sprayed against the pure white snow, a horrifying splash of crimson. Henry's body convulsed as the creature savored each brutal bite, his choked screams echoing through the forest until they faded into silence. Clara screamed, and the others turned to see the horror unfolding. Panic surged, and they bolted, carving paths down the slope, their skis cutting through snow with a desperate urgency. The wind seemed to carry the sound of the beast's pursuit, heavy breaths and snarls that grew louder with each second. Thomas shouted for them to stick together, but Clara, overtaken by terror, broke from the group, steering between the trees as she fought to distance herself. She didn't see the shadow that darted from her left until it was too late. A massive clawed hand swung out, slicing into her leg with brutal force. She crumpled to the ground, a scream wrenched from her throat as the beast loomed over her. In the dim moonlight, she saw it fully, its matted fur, twisted snout, and eyes that gleamed with a hunger that was almost sentient. It lowered its face to hers, the foul stench of its breath filling her senses as it pressed its jaws to her neck. With a sickening crunch, it tore her throat open, and her scream was choked in a flood of blood. The creature dragged her limp body into the shadows, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Rachel, Thomas, and James skidded to a halt at the lodge, panting, their faces pale and streaked with tears. They bolted the door behind them, clutching each other as they dialed the lodge phone. Ring after ring echoed through the empty halls, but no one answered. Desperate, they dialed the local sheriff, who arrived with a small team of deputies soon after, the blue and red lights casting strange shadows on the snow. The deputies searched the slope, following the blood trail left by Henry and Clara. They found remnants of shredded clothing, tufts of fur, but no sign of the creature. The trail itself seemed to vanish, swallowed by the dark or endless woods. "Who let you stay here?" the sheriff asked, eyeing the trio. "The owner," Thomas stammered. "Ben Talbot. He gave us a room." The sheriff's face paled, his expression clouded with disbelief. "Ben Talbot disappeared 20 years ago. He was last seen here at the lodge. They never found him, just rumors, stories of something that haunted these woods after he vanished. Folks said he became something monstrous." A chill swept through the room as the friends processed his words. The blizzard raged outside, howling as though it carried the cries of their lost friends. Steve and Marcia, a couple with a love for winter adventures, decided to escape to the snowy wilderness for a weekend of camping and snowmobiling. They set up camp in a secluded area, with snow stretching for miles and the crisp air sharp with the scent of pine. As they unloaded their gear, they noticed another couple nearby, a friendly pair named Calvin and Wendy, who were also seeking the solitude of the forest. They exchanged greetings, shared some food and drinks, and spent the early evening chatting about their plans to explore the area. After an hour of laughter and warmth, Calvin and Wendy announced their intention to explore for a bit. They agreed to reconvene at Steve and Marcia's camp later that night to play cards, eat, and drink. Steve and Marcia watched as their new friends disappeared into the twilight, the soft crunch of snow under their boots fading into the forest. As the evening deepened and darkness fell, the couple grew concerned. Calvin and Wendy had been gone far longer than expected, and the forest was silent. Unease crept over them, and they decided to take their snowmobiles to search. They called out through the trees, their voices swallowed by the night's icy breath. Snow drifted down from the dense canopy, and soon they realized they were lost. In the distance, they saw a faint light, a small log cabin, old and weathered, with smoke curling from the chimney. Relieved, they pulled up to the cabin, knocking on the door for help. An elderly man answered, his face gaunt and twisted into an unsettling smile. "Come in from the cold," he rasped, his voice thin and unsteady. "You're just in time for dinner." He invited them to sit at his small wooden table, where a bowl of steaming soup waited. "Haven't seen anyone out there tonight," he murmured, his eyes flickering with something dark as he took a sip of his soup. Steve and Marcia felt the room grow warmer, and a strange drowsiness began to settle over them. The old man chuckled, dipping his spoon into his soup. "Do you know," he began almost cheerfully, "what a wood chipper does to human flesh?" He pulled up the spoon to reveal something that sent a cold wave of horror through them. A human finger, bone and nail intact, floating amid the vegetables and broth. Marcia gasped, but her voice came out in a weakened whisper. At that moment, A loud grinding sound came from outside, like metal gnashing upon bone, and the old man's laughter filled the room. He began to stomp his feet against the wooden floor, a rhythmic, violent beat, his eyes wide with delirium as he slurped soup from the bowl, his mouth dripping with broth. Steve struggled to rise, but his limbs felt heavy, drugged. The old man lunged, slamming a knife through Steve's hand, pinning him to the table. Marcia screamed, grabbing a chair and slamming it against the old man's back. In a fury, he turned and bit her cheek, sinking his teeth into her skin, his laughter turning guttural and savage. Steve gritted his teeth, summoning all his strength to rip the knife from his hand, freeing himself. He threw himself at the old man, pulling him off Marcia and slamming him against the floor. Blood dripping from his hand, Steve grabbed Marcia, and they stumbled to the back door, flinging it open to escape. Outside, they froze. A hulking figure stood by a wood chipper, blood splattered across his clothes, pieces of shredded fabric and bone scattered in the snow around the machine. Steve recognized Calvin's jacket, shredded and smeared with blood, alongside the remains of Wendy's scarf, their stomachs twisted in horror. It was the old man's son, George. "Run!" Steve shouted, grabbing Marcia's arm. They sprinted to their snowmobiles as the man by the wood chipper, the old man's son, George, turned to chase them. His heavy footsteps pounded through the snow, and in the faint glow of the moonlight, they could see the glint of a blade in his hand. Steve managed to start his snowmobile, but before he could rev it, George tackled him, his thick, calloused hands squeezing around Steve's neck. Struggling against the weight, Steve grasped for anything, his hand finding a sharp rock buried in the snow. He drove it into George's temple, stunning him. Marcia helped pull Steve free, and they revved the snowmobile, hurtling into the night as the cabin and its horrors vanished behind them. They raced to the nearest town, reporting the ghastly incident to the authorities. The police investigated, but when they returned to the site, there was nothing. No cabin, no blood, no sign that anyone had lived there for decades. The sheriff, his face pale, told Steve and Marcia that the cabin had burned down over 30 years ago, and no one had seen the inhabitants since. The last traces of Calvin and Wendy were the chilling whispers of that cold winter night, lost to the echoes of the forest and the howl of the wind. In the frigid heart of winter, 3 friends, Mark, Jared, and Lisa, decide to shake off cabin fever with a weekend of ice fishing. They're drawn to an isolated frozen lake, far from any sign of civilization, where the silence is so complete that it seems to press down on them. They pack their supplies, a bottle of whiskey, and a few rolled joints for good measure, all in the hopes of relaxing and unwinding under the vast, cold sky. After setting up their gear, they huddle around a freshly drilled fishing hole, the warmth from their breath mingling with the icy air. A joint makes its way around, and soon a haze of smoke drifts over their little circle. Laughter fills the silence, and their relaxed chatter echoes over the empty lake. The whiskey burns their throats, warming them from the inside, and they feel untouchable. Just 3 friends, away from everything, miles from anyone. But as the conversation fades into contented silence, Jared narrows his eyes at something in the water. A shadow, just beneath the surface, too big and too deliberate to be a mere fish. He blinks, thinking he must have imagined it. The shadow vanishes as quickly as it appeared, and he laughs it off, chalking it up to the whiskey and the weed. Then, without warning, his fishing line pulls taut, nearly yanking the rod out of his hands. "Whoa," he mutters, gripping it tightly. Whatever is on the line pulls with an unnatural force, stronger than anything he's ever felt. The line jerks him forward, and he crashes onto the ice with a thud. Mark drops his beer on the ice. "Dude, what the?" he said in a low tone. Before Jared can gather himself, a slick, scaly hand bursts from the fishing hole, clawed fingers piercing and clamping onto the back of his neck with an iron grip. Mark and Lisa scream as they watch, paralyzed with horror, as the hand slams Jared's face against the ice. Blood spatters from his nose, painting the frozen surface red. Mark and Lisa try to move, but their legs feel like lead, frozen in place by a terror they can't comprehend. The hand grips Jared's head tighter, then begins to pull, dragging him toward the narrow hole in the ice. His limbs scrape and twist as the creature forces him, bit by bit, into the impossibly small opening. Bones snap with sickening crunches as his body is twisted to fit through, his blood pooling and mixing with the icy water, staining the lake a deep crimson. In seconds, he's gone, his life extinguished as he's pulled beneath the frozen surface, leaving only the haunting sound of cracking ice and splattered blood behind. Mark and Lisa snap out of their shock, scrambling to run across the treacherous ice. Their footsteps slip and falter, the surface too slick and unstable to find footing. Heartbeats pounding, they race for land, desperate to escape the nightmare beneath their feet. But beneath the ice, the shadow swims, circling them. Suddenly, the ice behind them splinters and shatters as the creature punches through, its dark, glistening hand reaching for them. Mark stumbles, nearly losing his footing as he pulls Lisa forward, just out of reach of the claws that scrape the ice where they stood only seconds before. Just as they near the shore, Lisa feels a sharp, piercing pain in her ankle. She gasps as claws puncture her skin, digging into her flesh. Blood pools beneath her as she wrenches free, stumbling forward with the last of her strength, pulling herself onto solid ground. Mark drags her further up the bank as they collapse in exhaustion, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They turn back, only to see the creature's head rising from the water where they once stood. It has an eerily human face, yet its skin is scaled and black, its eyes flat and unfeeling. Gills pulse along its neck, and a wide, lipless mouth opens to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. The creature stares at them, as if committing their faces to memory, before slipping back into the icy depths with barely a ripple, leaving the lake as silent as when they arrived. It couldn't chase them. The icy water was its home. They sit there, shivering, the cold seeping into their bones. And as the last light fades, they realize no one will ever believe what happened on that frozen lake.